The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fiery orange and deep purple. The city buzzed with its usual rhythm, but inside her modest living room, Theresa Williams sat in silence, her hands gripping a small black device. She never imagined she'd resort to something like this, something that felt so intrusive, so desperate. But a mother's love, especially hers, knew no bounds. Theresa was a woman of quiet strength. A single mother raising two children in the heart of Atlanta, she had seen her fair share of struggles. Life hadn't been kind, but she wore her resilience like armor. Her eldest son Malik was her pride and joy. A bright, ambitious 22-year-old who had dreams of becoming a civil rights lawyer. But his life had been tragically cut short just weeks ago, leaving a gaping hole in her heart and a lingering sense of unease. Malik's death had been ruled an accident. He was found in an alley downtown, the victim of what authorities called an unfortunate misstep. But the explanation never sat right with Theresa. Malik was careful, almost to a fault. He wasn't reckless, and he certainly wouldn't have been in that part of town without a good reason. Her suspicions grew stronger after the funeral, where she'd overheard hushed conversations, words like unfinished business, and he knew too much. But when she pressed for details, people clammed up or brushed her off. It was as though everyone knew something they weren't willing to say. As the days turned into weeks, Theresa found herself unable to let go. The nagging feeling in her chest refused to quiet down. She started going through Malik's belongings, looking for anything that might explain what had happened. His journals, his phone, even his text messages. None of it offered answers. But there was one thing that stayed with her. A voicemail from Malik left just hours before his death. His voice trembled as he said, "Mom, if anything happens to me, just know I was trying to do the right thing." Those words haunted her. What had he meant? What was the right thing? And why had he sounded so afraid? She replayed the message dozens of times, each listen amplifying her determination to uncover the truth. Then came the idea, an idea born out of desperation and a need for closure. Theresa had heard of people using hidden cameras to catch cheating spouses or dishonest employees. It was a drastic measure, but what if it could give her the answers she sought? At first, she dismissed the thought as absurd. Who would plant a camera in a coffin? But the more she thought about it, the more it made sense. She wasn't interested in Malik's remains. She wanted to see who came near his grave, who lingered too long, or who acted suspiciously. Maybe, just maybe, it would lead her to the truth. So she did it. She bought a tiny, discreet camera online, the kind that could easily blend in with the fabric of a lining. Late one evening, with trembling hands and a heavy heart, she carefully installed the device. She didn't tell a soul, not even her closest friends. This was her mission, her secret. The first few days brought nothing but heartbreak. Watching the footage felt invasive, as if she were violating her own grief. She saw people she recognized, family, friends, and even strangers who had heard about Malik's story and came to pay their respects. But it was on the fifth day that everything changed. As Theresa scrolled through the latest recording, something unusual caught her eye. It was the middle of the night, well past visiting hours, yet two shadowy figures appeared near Malik's grave. They moved cautiously, constantly glancing over their shoulders. Theresa leaned in closer, her breath hitching. The camera didn't capture their faces clearly, but their body language screamed tension. Something wasn't right. The figures crouched near the grave, their muffled voices barely audible through the recording. Theresa strained to make out what they were saying. "Can't leave it here," one of them whispered harshly. The other replied, "We don't have a choice. If anyone finds this..." The video cut off abruptly, leaving Theresa with more questions than answers. Her heart raced as she replayed the scene, hoping to catch something she missed. But it was all there, the fear, the urgency, and the unmistakable sense that these people were hiding something connected to Malik. Theresa's mind raced with possibilities. What were they doing near his grave? What couldn't they leave behind? And most importantly, what had her son gotten involved in that would lead to this? She knew one thing for certain. She couldn't stop now. Whatever these people were hiding, It was time to find out. Theresa couldn't sleep that night. The recording replayed in her mind over and over again. She could still hear the hushed voices, the tension thick in their words. Who were those people? What did they mean by "can't leave it here"? And why did they sound so desperate? Every question gnawed at her, pulling her deeper into a spiral of confusion and fear. She had hoped the camera would bring her clarity, but instead it had opened a door to even darker uncertainties. She sat in her dimly lit kitchen, a cup of untouched coffee growing cold in her hands. The small clock on the wall ticked louder than usual, marking the hours of her sleepless night. Theresa's mind wandered to Malik's childhood, to the boy who had always been so full of life. He'd been the kind of son who stood up for the underdog, the kid who wouldn't hesitate to lend his lunch money to a friend in need. As he grew older, that sense of justice only deepened. He joined activist groups, attended protests, and volunteered for community outreach programs. Theresa was proud of him, but she also worried. Malik's passion sometimes put him at odds with people who didn't appreciate his boldness. A few weeks before his death, Malik had come home looking more troubled than usual. He'd been working late nights and receiving calls that he always took in private. When Theresa asked him what was going on, he brushed it off, saying he was just busy with a project. But she could see the strain in his eyes. He was hiding something, and whatever it was, it weighed on him heavily. Now sitting alone in the kitchen, Theresa couldn't help but wonder if those late nights and secretive calls had anything to do with the figures at his grave. The next morning, Theresa decided she needed help. But who could she trust? Her first instinct was to turn to Detective Carter, the officer assigned to Malik's case. Carter had seemed sympathetic during the investigation, but he also been quick to close the case, labeling it an accident with little evidence to back it up. Theresa remembered how dismissive he'd been when she voiced her concerns. "I know this is hard, Mom," he had said, his tone flat. "But sometimes bad things just happen. It doesn't mean there's a conspiracy." She shook her head at the memory. No, Carter wasn't an option. Instead, she thought of Malik's best friend, Jamal. The two had been inseparable since middle school, practically brothers. Jamal had been devastated by Malik's death, but he also seemed to share Theresa's unease about the official explanation. At the funeral, he'd whispered to her, Malik was onto something big. I don't know what, but he told me it could change everything. Theresa picked up her phone and dialed Jamal's number. He answered on the second ring, his voice groggy but alert. "Mrs. Williams, everything okay?" "Jamal, I need to talk to you. It's about Malik," she said, her voice trembling. There was a pause on the other end before he replied, "I'll be there in 20 minutes." True to his word, Jamal showed up quickly, his face etched with concern. He was tall and lanky, with a quiet intensity that reminded Theresa of Malik. As he stepped into the living room, he glanced around nervously, as if expecting someone to be watching. "What's going on?" he asked, sitting down on the couch across from her. Theresa hesitated for a moment before showing him the footage from the hidden camera. As the video played, Jamal leaned forward, his brows furrowing deeper with each passing second. When it ended, he sat back, letting out a low whistle. This is serious," he muttered. "You recognize them?" Theresa asked, her voice barely above a
Jamal
whisper. Shook his head. "No, but they're definitely up to something. And I don't like the sound of 'can't leave it here.' What could they have meant?" "I don't know," Theresa admitted. "But whatever it is, it's connected to Malik. I'm sure of it." Jamal rubbed his hands together, his mind racing. Malik was always careful, but he wasn't afraid to dig deep when he thought something was wrong. A few months ago, he told me he was looking into some shady stuff happening in the neighborhood. He didn't give me all the details, but he mentioned corruption, people in power taking advantage of the community. He said it was bigger than he'd expected, and he didn't know who to trust. Theresa's heart sank. "Do you think that's why this happened?" "It's possible," Jamal said, his voice heavy. Malik didn't back down from a fight, even when it put him at risk. If he found something he wasn't supposed to, it could have made him a target. The weight of Jamal's words settled over the room like a dark cloud. Theresa felt a surge of anger mixed with fear. Her son had been fighting for what was right, and it had cost him his life. But who were these people, and what were they so desperate to hide? Jamal broke the silence. We need to figure out what Malik was working on. If we can piece it together, maybe we'll understand what's going on. Theresa nodded. I've gone through his things, but I didn't find much. Maybe I missed something. Together, they began combing through Malik's belongings. They started with his laptop, scrolling through his files and emails. Most of it was mundane: school assignments, resumes, and photos. Then they found a folder labeled Justice Initiative. Inside were notes, articles, and screenshots of what appeared to be financial documents. Malik had been investigating a local non-profit organization, one that claimed to help underprivileged families but had suspiciously large sums of money flowing in and out of its accounts. Theresa's hands trembled as she read through the documents. It was onto something big, she whispered. And dangerous, Jamal added, his voice grim. If this organization is involved in something illegal, and Malik found out, that could explain a lot. But there was more. At the bottom of the folder, they found a draft of an email Malik had never sent. It was addressed to an anonymous tip line and read, "*I have evidence of corruption involving high-level officials and a local non-profit. This needs to come to light, but I'm being followed. If anything happens to me, the truth is in the files. **. Theresa's heart ached as she read the words. Her son had known he was in danger, yet he pressed on anyway. His courage was both inspiring and devastating. Jamal looked up from the screen. "We need to be careful, Mrs. Williams. If these people were willing to kill Malik to keep this quiet, they won't think twice about coming after anyone else." Theresa nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'm not giving up, Jamal. Malik deserves justice. Whatever it takes, I'll find out the truth." But even as she said the words, a chill ran down her spine. She couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching, waiting, and that this was only the beginning. Theresa stared at the draft email, her mind racing with a mix of fear and determination. Malik had uncovered something far more sinister than she'd imagined, and now it felt like the weight of his mission had fallen squarely on her shoulders. She glanced at Jamal, who was still poring over the files with a furrowed brow. "This non-profit, do you think it's just a front?" she asked, her voice unsteady. "Probably," Jamal replied without looking up. "The money movement doesn't make sense. They're either laundering cash or funding something shady. And if Malik found evidence of who's involved, that would explain why they wanted him out of the picture." Theresa felt a wave of nausea. She knew Malik's commitment to justice, but she couldn't bear the thought of him facing such danger alone. She had been so busy trying to protect her family from life's everyday struggles that she hadn't seen the storm brewing right under her nose. And now she was left with the pieces of his unfinished fight. Before they could delve deeper, Jamal's phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at it and froze, his eyes narrowing. "That's strange," he muttered, picking it up. "What is it?" Theresa asked. "I've been getting these weird calls all week. No caller ID, no messages. I thought it was just spam. But now it's starting to feel off." He turned the phone toward her, showing her the blank screen indicating yet another missed call. "You think it could be connected?" Theresa's chest tightened. "It might be. You said Malik told you he was being followed. Maybe they're trying to scare you now." Jamal frowned. "If they are, it means they know we're looking into this." The realization hung heavy in the room. Theresa and Jamal exchanged a glance, both silently acknowledging the danger they were stepping into. But neither of them said the words aloud. It was as if speaking the fear would make it too real. Determined to push forward, they continued digging through the files. As they worked, Theresa's mind wandered to Malik's voicemail, the cryptic warning that had haunted her since the day she found it. She played it again, listening closely to the tremble in his voice. There was something about the way he said, "I was trying to do the right thing," that struck her as more than fear. It was as though he knew he might not succeed. She wondered if there were others who knew about Malik's investigation. Had he confided in anyone else? she decided to reach out to Shayla, Malik's former co-worker at the community center where he volunteered. Shayla was an outspoken activist who had always admired Malik's determination. If anyone had clues about what he'd been working on, it might be her. Theresa found Shayla's number and called her. After a few rings, the line connected, and Shayla's voice came through, warm but cautious. "Mrs. Williams, it's been a while. How are you holding up?" Theresa hesitated, her throat tightening. "I'm getting by. Shayla, I need to ask you something about Malik. It's important." There was a pause on the other end. "Of course. What's going on?" "I found some files on his laptop. He was investigating a nonprofit. Do you know anything about that?" Shayla sighed deeply. "I was afraid of this," she said softly. "Malik told me he was looking into some financial discrepancies at the center. He thought the nonprofit was funneling money into illegal activities, but he didn't want to pull me in too deep. He said it was safer if I didn't know too much." Theresa's stomach churned. "Do you think he was right? About the corruption?" Shayla's voice grew quieter. "I think he was onto something big, but I didn't have the proof to back it up. And honestly, I was scared. He wasn't wrong to keep me at arm's length." Theresa's grip tightened on the phone. "Did he ever mention feeling threatened, like someone was watching him?" "Yes," Shayla admitted reluctantly. "He said he'd seen strange cars parked outside his apartment and people following him when he walked home. I told him to go to the police, but he said he couldn't trust them. He felt like they were part of the problem." Theresa's heart sank further. It was the confirmation she didn't want, but already suspected. Malik had been fighting a battle against forces much larger and more dangerous than he realized. And now, those forces were circling closer. As the day stretched into the evening, Theresa couldn't shake the feeling that she and Jamal weren't safe. Every creak of the floorboards and shadow in the corner of her vision felt like a threat. She thought about the two figures at Malik's grave, their whispered conversation replaying in her mind. What had they meant by, "if anyone finds this"? It was as if they had left something behind, something that could either expose them or lead to even more danger. That night, Jamal suggested they visit the cemetery under the cover of darkness. If there was anything left behind near Malik's grave, they needed to find it before someone else did. Theresa was hesitant at first. The thought of sneaking around in the middle of the night sent a shiver down her spine. But her need for answers outweighed her fear. They arrived at the cemetery just before midnight, parking a few blocks away to avoid drawing attention. The air was cold and still, the only sounds coming from the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. Theresa pulled her coat tighter around her as they made their way through the rows of headstones. Malik's grave stood out in the moonlight, adorned with fresh flowers from visitors who still mourned him. Jamal carried a small flashlight, keeping the beam low to avoid being seen. He scanned the ground carefully, looking for anything out of place. "If they left something, it could be buried nearby," he whispered. Theresa knelt beside the grave, running her fingers over the earth. Her heart pounded as she thought about what they might find. Was it a clue? A warning? Or something far worse? Just as she was about to give up, Jamal called out softly. "Over here. I found something." He was crouched a few feet away, his flashlight illuminating a small patch of disturbed soil. Theresa hurried over, her breath catching in her throat. Jamal began to dig carefully with his hands, uncovering a small weathered box. It was metal, with rusted hinges and a faded lock. Theresa's pulse quickened as he pried it open. Inside were several documents, a USB drive, and a folded piece of paper. Theresa unfolded the paper with trembling hands. Scrawled across it in Malik's handwriting were the words, "Asterisk if you're reading this, they're watching. Trust no one. Asterisk." Her blood ran cold. Theresa stared at the note in her hands, her breath hitching as the weight of Malik's words settled over her. Asterisk, trust no one. Asterisk, the warning felt like a dagger, sharp and unrelenting, as if Malik had somehow known this moment would come. She glanced at Jamal, who was still focused on the contents of the box, his expression tense. "We need to see what's on that USB drive," Jamal whispered, slipping it into his pocket. "But not here. It's too risky." Theresa nodded, her pulse racing. The air around them felt charged, as if unseen eyes were watching from the shadows. Every rustle of leaves and distant creak of a tree made her flinch. They quickly reburied the box and hurried back to the car, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. Neither of them spoke on the drive back to Theresa's house, the silence filled with unspoken fears and questions. When they arrived, they locked the doors and drew the curtains before Jamal plugged the USB drive into Theresa's laptop. The files loaded slowly, each passing second stretching into an eternity. Finally, a folder appeared on the screen. It was labeled Phoenix. "What is this?" Theresa murmured, leaning closer. Jamal clicked on the folder, revealing a series of documents, photos, and videos. As they scrolled through the files, a horrifying picture began to emerge. The non-profit Malik had been investigating was indeed a front, but not just for laundering money. The documents outlined a network of high-ranking officials, business leaders, and law enforcement officers involved in human trafficking. Funds intended for community programs were being funneled into this illegal operation, and the scale of it was staggering. Theresa felt sick as she read through the details. This can't be real," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "How could something like this happen right under our noses?" Jamal's face was grim. "This is why Malik was killed. He found all of this, and they couldn't let him expose it." The videos were the most damning evidence. Hidden camera footage showed meetings between key players, their conversations laced with coded language about shipments and deliveries. Malik had pieced together the code, linking it to locations, dates, and victims. One video, in particular, made Theresa's heart stop. It was grainy, but she recognized Malik's voice. He was confronting someone, his tone steady but firm. "You can't keep doing this," Malik said in the recording. "I have enough evidence to take you all down." The other voice was lower, menacing. "You're making a mistake, kid. Walk away while you still can." Theresa covered her mouth, unable to hold back her tears. Malik had been so brave, so determined to do the right thing, even when it meant risking his life. And now she understood just how dangerous these people were. "We need to take this to the authorities," she said, her voice trembling. "This can't stay hidden." Jamal hesitated, his eyes darting to the windows. Malik didn't trust the police, remember? If this network is as big as it seems, there's no telling how far their influence reaches. We could end up handing this evidence straight to the wrong people. Theresa's stomach twisted. He was right. Malik's warning echoed in her mind. Asterisk trusts no one. Asterisk. But if they couldn't go to the authorities, who could they turn to? As they sat in heavy silence, a sudden noise shattered the stillness, a sharp knock at the door. Both Theresa and Jamal froze, their eyes locking in mutual panic. The knock came again, louder this time. "Are you expecting anyone?" Jamal whispered. Theresa shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. She gestured for Jamal to stay quiet as she approached the door, peeking through the peephole. A man in a dark suit stood on the porch, his face partially obscured by the dim light. He looked official, but there was something unsettling about his presence. "Mrs. Williams," the man called out, his voice calm but firm. "We need to talk. It's about your son." Theresa's breath caught. How did he know her name? And why now, of all times? Her instincts screamed at her to stay silent, but the man continued. "We know you've been looking into Malik's case," he said. "You're in over your head. Open the door and we can help you." Theresa backed away, her hands shaking. "Who are you?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. "Someone who wants to keep you safe," the man replied, but his tone lacked sincerity, and the words felt like a threat more than a reassurance. Jamal motioned for her to step away from the door. "Don't trust him," he mouthed, his expression urgent. The knocking stopped, but the tension lingered. Theresa listened carefully, her ears straining for any sound. Footsteps retreated down the porch, followed by the hum of a car engine starting. She exhaled shakily, her body trembling with adrenaline. They know, Jamal said quietly. Whoever that was, they know we have the files. Theresa sank into a chair, her mind racing. What do we do now? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jamal paced the room, his hands running through his hair. We need to find someone outside the system, someone who can expose this without tipping them off. Theresa thought of Malik's activist circles, the people who had marched with him, fought with him for justice. There had to be someone among them who could help. But reaching out would be risky. Every call, every message could be traced. They were running out of time, and the walls felt like they were closing in. As they debated their next move, the house phone rang. Theresa hesitated, staring at it as if it were a snake poised to strike. The number was blocked. Her heart pounded as she picked up the receiver, her voice shaking. Hello? A voice on the other end was distorted, mechanical. You've seen too much, it said. If you value your life, stop now. The line went dead before Theresa could respond. She dropped the phone, her hands trembling. Jamal picked it up, checking the caller ID, but there was nothing. They're watching us, Theresa said, her voice barely audible. They're not going to stop. Jamal placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, that his own fear was evident. Then we don't stop either, he said. Malik didn't give up, and neither will we. Theresa nodded, her resolve hardening despite the fear clawing at her. Malik had fought for justice, and now it was up to her to finish what he started. But as the night stretched on, the shadows outside seemed to grow darker, and the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on her. She didn't know how this would end, but one thing was certain, there was no turning back now. Theresa sat in the dimly lit living room, her hands gripping the edge of the table, as if it were the only thing keeping her grounded. The distorted voice on the phone replayed in her mind, its cold threat lingering like a shadow in the room. Jamal was pacing again, his restless energy filling the silence as he mumbled to himself, piecing together the fragments of Malik's investigation. Then the second knock came. It wasn't loud or hurried like before, but deliberate and calculated, sending a chill up Theresa's spine. She and Jamal exchanged a glance, their fear reflected in each other's eyes. This time, Theresa didn't move toward the door. Instead, she mouthed to Jamal, *, check the back. *. Jamal crept toward the kitchen window, peeking through the curtain. There's no car outside, he whispered. Whoever it is, they're on foot. Theresa's heart raced. Whoever was knocking didn't feel the need to make a quick escape, and that made it even more unsettling. As Jamal slipped out of sight, she braced herself, trying to keep her breathing steady. The knocking stopped abruptly, replaced by the sound of paper sliding under the door. A moment later, footsteps receded into the night. Jamal returned, holding a baseball bat he'd grabbed from the closet. Whoever it was, they're gone, he said cautiously. Theresa walked to the door and picked up the folded piece of paper. Her hands trembled as she unfolded it. The message was brief but chilling. * gets closer than you think. *. What does that mean? Jamal asked, leaning over her shoulder. Closer than what? Theresa shook her head, her mind racing. I don't know, but it feels like they're trying to mess with us. Make us paranoid. Jamal's jaw tightened. It's working. They spent the rest of the night going through the files on the USB drive again, searching for anything they might have missed. As dawn broke, Theresa's exhaustion turned to dread. Despite the overwhelming evidence, they still had no clear plan. Every potential move felt like walking into a trap. Then, as Jamal scrolled through the videos, he froze. Wait, he said, rewinding a clip. This guy, I see him before. Theresa leaned closer. The man in the video was older, wearing an expensive suit and speaking in low tones to another figure. Who is he? She asked. Jamal hesitated, his brow furrowing. He's a city councilman. I saw him at a community event Malik invited me to last year. He was all smiles, talking about improving the neighborhood. Theresa felt a knot tighten in her stomach. If he's involved, this goes even higher than we thought. Jamal pulled out his phone, searching for the councilman's name. Here, he said, showing her an article. It was about a local development project. A partnership between the councilman and the non-profit Malik had been investigating. This isn't just corruption, Theresa said slowly, the pieces clicking into place. They're using the non-profit to buy land, pushing people out of their homes under the guise of development. It's all part of the same network. Jamal nodded grimly. And anyone who gets in their way, like Malik, is silenced. Theresa's anger flared. Malik had always believed in the power of community, and now it was being exploited by the very people who claimed to serve it. She couldn't let his death be in vain. But before they could decide their next move, Jamal's phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, stop digging. Final warning. Asterisk. He showed it to Theresa, his face pale. They're watching us, he said. They must have access to my phone. Theresa felt the walls closing in again. They couldn't trust the police. They couldn't trust their phones. And now, they couldn't even trust their own home. She thought about Malik's note. Asterisk trusts no one. Asterisk. Then an idea struck her. What if we leak it? She said suddenly. The files, the videos, everything. If we put it online, they can't silence us without exposing themselves. Jamal hesitated. That's a huge risk. They'll know it came from us. But if we get the public involved, they won't be able to cover it up, Theresa argued. It's our best chance to shine a light on this. Jamal looked at her, weighing the danger against the potential impact. Finally, he nodded. Okay, he said, but we need to do it carefully. No traces back to us. As they began setting up an anonymous upload, Theresa's phone rang. The caller ID showed a familiar number, one she hadn't seen in months. It was Malik's. She stared at the screen, her blood running cold. It's impossible, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jamal leaned over, his eyes widening. What do you mean? His phone was destroyed in the accident. The phone continued to ring, each chime slicing through the tense silence. Finally, Theresa answered, her hand trembling. Hello, she said, her voice cracking. For a moment, there was nothing but static. Then a voice came through, faint and distorted. Mom, it's not safe. Theresa's heart stopped. The voice was Malik's, or at least it sounded like him. But how could that be? Malik, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Is it really you? The line crackled again, the voice breaking into fragments. Files, they're coming. Run. Then the call went dead. Theresa dropped the phone, her mind spinning. That wasn't real, she said, her voice trembling. It couldn't be. Jamal picked up the phone, checking the call log. The number was untraceable, listed as unknown. It sounded like him, he admitted. But how? If they're messing with us. Before he could finish, the sound of tires screeching outside interrupted him. They both froze, turning toward the window. 2 black SUVs had pulled up in front of the house, their engines still running. They'd found us, Jamal said, his voice filled with panic. Theresa grabbed the laptop and the USB drive, shoving them into a bag. We need to go. Now. As they bolted for the back door, the sound of footsteps echoed from the front porch. The nightmare was no longer lurking in the shadows. It was at their doorstep. Theresa and Jamal sprinted out the back door, their breaths coming in short, panicked gasps as they ducked into the shadows of the alley behind the house. The SUVs outside rumbled ominously, their headlights slicing through the darkness like searchlights. From the front of the house, muffled voices carried through the night, sharp commands and heavy footsteps. Whoever they weren't wasting time. Clutching the bag tightly against her chest, Theresa felt the weight of the evidence inside. It was everything Malik had died for, everything these people were killed to bury. She couldn't let it end here. Jamal gestured toward a narrow path that led to a nearby park, and they moved quickly, staying low as they wove through the maze of backyards and fences. We can't keep running like this, Jamal whispered, his voice strained. They'll track us down eventually. Theresa nodded, her mind racing. We need to get the files out now. If we don't, none of this will matter. Jamal pulled out his phone, but Theresa grabbed his arm. No, she said firmly. They're already monitoring our phones. We need a public space, somewhere we can upload everything without being traced. They emerged from the alley into the park, the open expanse of grass and trees stretching out before them. The street lights cast long shadows, and the faint hum of traffic buzzed in the distance. Theresa spotted a small community center at the edge of the park, its lights still on despite the late hour. There, she said, pointing. If we can use their Wi-Fi, we can get everything online. They sprinted toward the building, adrenaline pushing them forward. The front door was unlocked, and they slipped inside, the quiet hum of the air conditioning a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Jamal quickly found a computer terminal, and Theresa handed him the USB drive. As he plugged it in and began uploading the files for a secure site, Theresa kept watch at the window. Her heart pounded in her chest as she scanned the empty parking lot, every shadow and movement setting her nerves on edge. How much longer? She asked, her voice tight. Almost there, Jamal replied, his fingers flying over the keyboard. Just a few more minutes. But they didn't have a few minutes. A set of headlights appeared at the far end of the lot, followed by another, then another. The SUVs were back, their engines roaring as they sped toward the building. They'd found us, Theresa said, her voice trembling. We need to hurry. Jamal nodded, his focus unwavering as the progress bar on the screen inched closer to completion. Theresa grabbed a fire extinguisher from the wall and positioned herself near the door, her hands shaking as she prepared for whatever was coming. The SUVs screeched to a halt outside, and men in dark suits poured out, their faces grim and determined. Theresa could hear them shouting orders as they approached the building. She tightened her grip on the extinguisher, her heart hammering in her chest. Then, just as the door burst open, Jamal shouted, "It's done." He pulled a USB drive from the computer and shoved it into his pocket as the first man stepped inside. Theresa released the nozzle of the extinguisher, a cloud of white foam engulfing the doorway. The men shouted in confusion, their movements disoriented as they tried to push through the chaos. Theresa and Jamal bolted for the back exit, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. Outside, they found themselves in another alley, the cold night air biting against their skin. The SUVs were parked haphazardly, their drivers still inside. Theresa spotted an old delivery truck nearby, its keys dangling from the ignition. "Come on," she said, pulling Jamal toward it. They climbed in and started the engine, the loud rumble drawing the attention of the men behind them. As the truck lurched forward, bullets ricocheted off the metal frame, but they didn't stop. Theresa gripped the wheel tightly, her knuckles white as she sped away from the scene. Jamal turned to her, his face pale but determined. "The files are out there now," he said. "They can't stop it." Theresa nodded, her mind racing. The evidence was online, but that didn't mean they were safe. These people wouldn't stop until they silenced anyone who could connect them to the operation. Hours later, as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Theresa and Jamal found refuge in a motel on the outskirts of town. Exhausted but alive, they watched the news unfold on the small television in their room. The files had been picked up by multiple news outlets, the story spreading like wildfire. Names were being named, arrests were being made, and the network Malik had uncovered was finally being dismantled. Theresa felt a surge of relief, but it was short-lived. Her phone buzzed, and when she checked the screen, it was another unknown number. This time, the message was different. Asterisk well played, but it's not over. Asterisk. Her stomach sank as she stared at the words, the victory she'd have felt moments ago slipping away. Jamal leaned over, reading the message, his expression grim. "They're not going to give up, are they?" he asked. Theresa shook her head. "No, but neither are we." As they sat in the motel room, the weight of what they had done settling over them, Theresa realized that the fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Malik's voice echoed in her mind, a reminder of the courage it took to stand up against injustice. She would carry that courage with her, no matter how dark the road ahead.